Welcome back to Responsibly Unhinged after an eye-opening episode for many. Um, I planned initially to kind of just like continue down that journey, but I have been reflecting a little bit on kind of the headspace I was in when that stuff was taking place and thinking back on like behavioral patterns and things of that fun nature. And honestly, like over the last few months, things have like felt kind of similar to where I was at then, especially over the last few weeks. I've been just struggling with a lot mentally, and I wanted to kind of just speak on that a little bit more and also provide a little bit more context to how I got here as well. Um, so this episode is a little bit different. I know we've kind of went back and forth with some that are a little more of like a serious storytelling versus like funny or a little bit in between. But this one is kind of just going to tell a little bit more about some of the things that just had a large impact on me over the last year, I guess, for the lack of better words. But what I'm really trying to work on here is just like painting as honest of a picture of it as I can, and also just like being really honest because I was recently told actually by my mom that I am a blecker is the words that she used. That she was like, when I'm dealing with something like heavy or deep, I often process things by speaking about them. And when something feels really serious to me or really important and really weighs on me, it actually like really eats me up inside when I feel like I can't like talk to people about it. And a lot of this is stuff that I could talk to like friends and people close in my life. But when I'm coming on a platform like this and my like goal is to be authentic and share stories and share pieces of things, and I feel like I have to like talk around certain subject matter, it doesn't sit well with me. And it also feels like I'm like, it's not that I owe anyone or any of you really either, even like any explanations on certain things or anything, but I just feel like it like leaves gaps in context, and that I also just have this philosophy in general and kind of the meaning behind this podcast where I want to like provide comedic relief and make you not feel alone in shitty dating experiences. But I also just want to, uh, what's the best way to say this? I want to like help other people like through if they may be going through these similar feelings. Because to me, like when I find other resources that speak about what I'm going through, it's really, really helpful to me. And I've just kind of refused to believe that all of the random shit that happens to me doesn't happen and pile up for just no reason. That's kind of, like I said, what my motivator behind the podcast was. So I'm just going to kind of dive into it. This could be a little messy. I am feeling a little bit anxious about doing it. Some of the things I'm going to talk about in this episode, I haven't talked about publicly, or if I have, it's been one time. I actually spoke about some of this on my other podcast briefly in just a very different way, though. So bear with me. If you're watching the YouTube, I'm going to be looking probably really uncomfortable. And if you're listening, I really don't know what kind of journey we're going to be on. So I want to kind of just start out by saying that I like I said, I've just not really been mentally in I feel like it sounds really bizarre to be like in my right mind, but I just have been a little bit out of sorts lately. And I recently got back into therapy, which we love, right? And what we have kind of uncovered is that a diagnosis I received in March has just been kind of exacerbated over recent events and things that have been going on for me have kind of just like re-triggered that. It's not something that like was going to just go away, but I was kind of making some movements towards it, and now I'm having a lot of those symptoms present again. So what happened is in March I received the diagnosis of having c-PTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So most of us have heard of like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The C in front of it just stands for complex, which I have actually just opened up about this over the last week on Instagram. So I, was kind of preparing myself to talk a little bit about this, but CPTSD is an anxiety condition essentially, and you experience some symptoms of PTSD. It basically has most of the same symptoms and presentation as PTSD, but it has an additional list of symptoms that are basically like things difficulty controlling your emotions, feeling really angry and just like distrustful kind of towards the world in general. And it also comes with a really fun compilation of feelings of like worthlessness and guilt and shame, a lot of difficulty controlling your emotions, finding it really hard to feel connected with other people, which also leads to like relationship problems, whether that's with friends or partners or potential partners, etc. So, a lot of this stuff came up for me because when I was going to therapy in the spring, I was really struggling with like severe focus issues, which I'm a former perfectionist and I'm someone who like, I was like a 4.0 grad school student. Like I never had issues getting shit done. I have always been a procrastinator. I will say that. That's not changed. I'm someone who like always was like, I work better under pressure or under stress, whether that's bullshit or not. Either way, I've always done it. But it's always been like, it gets done. And, once I know I have a deadline or something to do, it's like, I can work for 14 hours straight and work on that thing. Like, that's always been how I've operated. Even if it's not necessarily the best, it's always worked. And I kind of got to this place where that wasn't possible. And I was also in this kind of conundrum where my pattern is to wait to do things till last minute. And that wasn't working when I could no longer like sit down and grind away. Right. So like I started feeling like I was having a lot of focus issues. I was lacking a lot of motivation. I've kind of spoken on that on and off about whether it was like fitness and health or my job or anything really. I just like started feeling very, very disconnected with really everything. I was constantly tired. I was constantly exhausted. My anxiety was heightened. I was started having a lot of short-term memory issues. I'm still kind of dealing with that. I actually used to be the friend, like some of my high school friends used to tease me and be like, Kylie, you remember like such obscure things. Like, and I used to do that about like, I would be able to like talk to a friend about a night we went out and I would remember not only what I was wearing, but like what they were wearing, like things like that. And a lot of my older memories like that are still there, but I noticed things over this last year. I have a harder time. Like people are constantly being like, I already told you this, or, we just talked about this. And that started being really frustrating for me. And so we kind of like lumped together that over basically the time frame from like, really, it started like last July through March, but particularly the events of like July to November of 21. I had a series of things unfold that caused this to happen. So basically, another thing with c-PTSD is it tends to be from more than one incident. Like most people have PTSD from one specific thing happening to them. And this, that you can get c-PTSD from that. But what happened basically is like so many things were happening to me simultaneously and like without breathing room between them that my brain essentially was like, it used the coping mechanism of just like creating a distorted reality. So I just kind of like dissociated with a lot of stuff, or I like was constantly moving on to the next thing and not having any time to process any of the one things that had happened to me, because it was just like one trauma, whether it's a big T or little t trauma, after another. And so because I couldn't keep up or process any of those things, I just kind of like was shutting down, essentially, is the best way to put that. And that didn't look like normal manifestation of that. Like I'm not saying that I just like went into like what a lot of people visualize as like depression is, like, you don't leave your house and all of those things, because I also constantly work to try to not be in that place. And I am a very extroverted person, but I was having all of those type of thoughts. Last October, I was in a place where I really was like not sure I still wanted to be here. I went through a lot of those things, and some of that has been kind of coming back up for me. And basically what all of that had led to, like I said, was those side effects and symptoms coming up in March. And then over the few months past that, we started like working through that. I started doing different types of therapy for that with my therapist in Nashville. And then I got involved in some situations this year. I've had some family stuff come up this year. I've had some friend stuff come up this year that she said basically was just kind of like re-triggering a lot of those things and putting me back into that place. So, like I said, there's kind of like this divide is like there's the factors are not that different between PTSD and c-PTSD, but the way the symptoms manifest can be different. So, PTSD and c-PTSD include like a lot of nightmares. You have like kind of like a lot of flashbacks about these things, having like just like a hyper arousal or like startling response to little things, feeling like constantly paranoid and anxious, really sudden bursts of emotion. All of that has been pretty present for me on and off for months. And then on top of that, like I said, the biggest thing with the C in front of it adds that it changes really your self-concept. So how you see yourself, how you see the people who put you in this position, or like the people whose behaviors like you see as like a perpetrator, essentially, their morals and values, like their faith in others, sometimes your spiritual faith disrupted if you're someone who like believes in God or any of those things. You start to really doubt all of this. And really basically it just changes your entire worldview, because you're trying to make sense of like how what's happened to you can exist in that same realm. And like it really becomes difficult basically to like maintain a belief that you yourself and the world around you is still like good or safe. So a lot of different things can trigger this response. Sights, sounds, smells, thoughts can remind you of an event. I have a very specific trigger that has been an issue for me, and I will make that more clear once I get to that part of the story, because it won't make sense without context. But sound for me has been an issue when it comes to that one. And, it can be as simple, though, as like very obvious things like, if we're talking about someone who has like an assault PTSD, it's like obviously if you see like a news report of like an assault, that could trigger you. But sometimes it's a lot more simple than that, and people like really underestimate that. Like it can be if you were like something bad happened to you, or like whatever the thing is happened on like a bright sunny day, like coming outside into a bright sunny day can like trigger you to have those kind of like flashbacks. So it's kind of like individualized for everyone, obviously, but you do a lot of reliving, you experience a lot of flashback behavior, a lot of night terrors, whether about the thing or not. That's something that definitely is really present for me. And just kind of feeling really detached or estranged whenever you are trying to engage in things. So that's kind of a synopsis of like what I've been experiencing, and what's been super fun. And again, when you just pile on to the fact that this kind of heightens as weather gets shittier, like seasonal depression, people, where you at? All of that becomes kind of like really difficult to navigate. So a lot of the stuff, like I said, that's happened over the last few months, I haven't got to on this podcast yet, but a lot of the things that gave the initial problem or brought me to the initial place did happen obviously last year. And one of those things I've been very open about on this podcast is the narcissistic relationship, and realizing that I was coming out of that, kind of having the overhaul of information of realizing what kind of dynamic I was in. And like that type of mental or emotional abuse in itself can cause some of these triggers. But it really wasn't just that. And I think something when I had Jordan on that we kind of talked about is like, she was honestly worried that maybe we didn't like make it clear how this guy really was and stuff. And it's part of me is like, I had so much more to say about this that I didn't, because this part of it I've kept into myself because it is really hard for me to talk about, and because societally it's really hard to talk about. So on top of that, like I said, it was a multitude of things. So I'm just going to kind of paint the timeline of last year and get into that particular subject. But some of the smaller revolving things is that, like I said, I got done bodybuilding last June. That coaching relationship wasn't ideal. It was causing some real mental distrain and body dysmorphia problems. I was having a lot of identity crisis coming out of that. I was starting to have a lot of issues with food and my body and weightlifting and stuff from that. So I was dealing with all of that. And in that time frame, as I expressed in the early episodes, it's when like Goodwill and I were kind of trying to like mend things / not whatever. The month of June is when I competed. And that is the month that him and I had like taken this like intentional sex break, right? Like, so we had been like seeing each other again through like April and May. And then he declared that he wanted to take a step back from physical intimacy to like make sure our feelings were really like genuine and it wasn't just, this sex thing. Right. So we wanted to be like, quote unquote, just friends. So he hung out with me and my friends every weekend that month. We weren't sleeping together, but we were still like making out on the weekends and like, he was staying at my place, all of that stuff. So during that time frame, that was kind of like a weird thing I was navigating. I definitely like was really reinvested in the relationship. At the very end of the month, is I had something that has come full circle now that I will save for another podcast episode. Cause like I said, I'm trying to just like focus on one thing at a time. But I had like a potential family ordeal pop up, like someone who's not really been in my life. An opportunity presented itself to connect with them. And that opportunity was presented to me, and I didn't really do anything with it because I had so much going on and I kind of was just like really nervous about it. But the person I reached out to, and I think I did allude to this in the episodes about Goodwill, was him, because we had similar things to kind of connect on in that realm. And so we, got together, and I kind of like opened up about the anxiety I was feeling around this situation arising and things like that. And that is the night that he and I started sleeping together again. I kind of like had been like emotionally outpouring to him and things like that. And we kind of just like fell right back into things. So we were together like all of the weekend of 4th of July, all of that, and then all through July. During this time, July and going into August, then I am in the process, right, of like supposed to be reverse dieting from my show, and doing all of that. I lost my period during my competition season, which is not uncommon for bodybuilders, but it's not a sign of like a healthy body. But I had not gotten it back yet. And so through the reverse diet process, that's usually when you bring that period back. So I got through July, and we were kind of like in this space where I thought things were moving forward, but we still weren't like redefining our relationship or any of those things. And we made it to August, and I started having a lot of these crazy symptoms. And I was just like, this is before I was having any of this like PTSD stuff come up at all, right? I was just like incredibly fatigued, and I felt like I was gaining weight like really quickly. And I wasn't being very good with my reverse diet. So I was kind of blaming that. But it was just like at an aggressive rate. It felt like it was only like localized to specific areas. And I just like was really struggling like mentally. I felt like I was like strung out. And part of me, when, my friends were kind of like, oh, this is just because like Goodwill is confusing you. But like I was just constantly anxious. I was constantly spiraling. My emotions were all over the place. And I was just like feeling insane. So I got about midway through August, and I was talking with my dear friend Kara, and I was just like, I think today I need to take a pregnancy test. And so I was like, I don't understand. I haven't had a period, so ideally I shouldn't even be ovulating. That shouldn't even be happening. But I was like, I don't really think it can be this, but I'm just like so confused about all these things that I'm feeling. Like I just basically had a check-in with my old coach, or my last coach. And that morning, it's like he responded was just like, I'm at a loss with what's happening with your body, and he kind of was trying to give me a real talk. He kind of thought I think that I was like off the rails and not telling him. He was pretty baffled, even as a coach, because he was just like, I don't, he had no idea what it could be. And so I told her, I was like, I have to try. So I did. I took one. I actually ended up picking 3 over the course of the day. And if you can kind of put that together, the reason I took so many is because they kept coming up positive. So I obviously was pretty shook by this. It's no secret if you know me, and especially if you knew my relationship with Goodwill, that kids weren't really on the table. But outside of that, they really weren't on the table when I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in downtown Nashville and sleeping with my ex-boyfriend. Like we weren't even together. And when we were together, it's a conversation we had always had. Like we didn't plan on starting a family. So I was really nervous. And something that I think was probably a red flag right away is that I felt immensely more nervous to have to talk to him about it and have to tell him than I felt about the scenario itself. So I was panicking. I ended up going and driving out there and telling him. And this is the part that I'm saying I did speak about this whole situation. I just want to start by saying I did talk about this on the Not Your Quick Fix podcast, but I kept it very strategic and spoke about like the bare minimum to be able to just talk about the situation at hand. And I was pretty kind about his involvement, because some things hadn't come to light yet, and because that's not the type of podcast that was for, right? We were trying to focus on like the hormone side of it all. And so I basically like, I felt really afraid. And I went out to where he was living, and, just spilled everything, told him what was happening. And he immediately threw up a few times, which fair. We, had the conversation, and it was, it was intense. It was scary. Like we were both freaking out. Didn't really know what to do about it. And I couldn't get rid of this like immense, just like fear feeling that I had. And I like, don't know how to explain it. And now I only can know that there was something about my body. Like, I think being more afraid now, I know this, and it's probably really easy to like fill in this blank, but I've talked to my therapist about it a lot, that there was just like, I think this underlying fear that I didn't recognize yet of the possibility of being tied to this forever. Because at this point, even though I desperately wanted us to be back together, I was very aware that like we weren't the healthiest couple. Like, and my biggest fear, and part of the reason I have not always been necessarily sure I wanted kids, is because I have had this like fear of like traumatizing them. Because of, I never like to speak ill of my own upbringing or anything like that, but it was not traditional. It was not normal. And I was loved and had like an incredible environment. And I still got loads of issues. That's why I have a dating podcast. And it's because of that kind of like odd dynamic that we had. Right. And so I was just like, unless I know that I can bring someone into like a super safe environment, and like this guy was just like not a safe person. Like, even if we take out the narcissism of it all, like the man was just like a ticking time bomb. Like, he was super chaotic. He was a one-man circus at all times. Like, he didn't have any kinds of like insurances on anything. Like, it's just a lot going on. Like, not someone who should be having a family. And I think a lot of that was like underlying in my anxiety too. So we kind of talked through all the things like, what are we going to do? How are we handle this? And over the next few days, we had these conversations, and I just remember going places and like seeing people with kids and stuff and looking at their families. And I was just like, I do not see this for us. Like, I don't. And he, had kind of spoken to me in a way that was like, I will say, he was like, this is your decision, whatever we choose to do about this. Like, ultimately it's your choice. But then it was kind of followed with like a lot of how he really felt about it, which is that he didn't think we should do it. Like, didn't think we should have the baby. And I was back and forth a lot about it, to be honest. But ultimately, there was just something pulling at me that was like, this is not right. Like, this is not how this is supposed to be. And, we made that decision together, to terminate the pregnancy. And this is something that, like, this experience I want to be very clear in how I talk about this, is not in and of itself the thing that caused me trauma. I do not have any regrets. And a big part of the reason I feel so passionately about that is because of this experience I went through. What the problem was is how this was handled, my experience through it, and his behavior in that time frame. So that's kind of what I want to get into. And the fact that I have not really felt like I can talk about this, like my family doesn't know about this, and I'm out here talking about it on podcast. Like, it's that shame and fear and guilt around the entire situation was crippling. And it's shame and fear and guilt I only had because of the way other people feel about this issue and other people feel about what you're doing with your life. And that was unsettling. Like, I felt comfort in my own choice, but I felt very triggered by the behavior that was happening around me. So like, going into this, we already had just like a slew of really bizarre issues, like trying to get access. Even this is at a time when this was still legal in Tennessee, and trying to even get in for an appointment before I would be past the point that was legal was a nightmare. And that's when there was clinics that were legally open, right? There was enough of them, and just wait lists and things like that were insane. And so we were like not even sure if I was going to be able to get in somewhere on time. And it was like just a whole nightmare process. And in the midst of this, of feeling like it was something that I didn't tell as many friends and stuff as I have now, because I was so scared of anyone like judging me or shaming me or being like, I don't know who I can talk to about this or where everyone's views lies. And the week that this ended up finally happening for me, the week that we finally had appointments and everything, is the week that the first ban on stuff happened in Texas. And so I feel like this is always an ongoing like issue on and off, but it's not constantly talked about. And that week it was. So the week I'm going through it, it's every time I opened my social media feed, was people talking about it. Every time I turned on a TV, people were talking about it, because it's before the Roe versus Wade overturn. It was just when Texas started things. And it was really hard. It was really hard to open my social media feeds and see people who have known me my whole life that don't know what's going on, and see that, they're basically talking about that people like me are murderers, and that people like me are terrible people, and that I'm selfish, and that like I'm going to hell, and like whatever else. And that was really fucking difficult. And the reason I want to speak on this about is that there are a lot more people out there like me that you have no idea that they have done this, or like what led them to be in this position. And, I think also a lot of stories that the only time people feel any kind of like kindness about this is when someone has like something really traumatic that happened to them, when it comes to like an assault or something like that. And even some people don't have grace for that, but there's not a lot of people that are comfortable telling their story like me, where it's just like, this doesn't feel right. But especially when it uncovers, and now I've learned, like, the type of person that I was really in a relationship with, like what kind of parent they would have been. It would have been repeating this cycle, like that narcissistic parent abuse cycle. That's how he ended up the way he is, like as his parent. So like, we don't take a lot of that into account. And the reality is nearly 1 in 4 women have an abortion. Like in any given room you're in, a lot of people there have probably experienced it. Most people that do it are already moms. Like, we're not hateful, evil fucking people. And somebody else somebody else you love and care about has probably been through this. And the thing I want to get across is we see it. We see the stuff that you're sharing. We see the stuff that you're saying about us without you even knowing it's about us. And it's really difficult. And maybe that's your point. But I just like to reiterate, it is not difficult because my decision was bad or that I feel bad about it. It's hard because I feel like this shame because of how people judge you. And so I was going through this very like isolating experience. And what I spoke to on Quick Fix is that Goodwill was very quote unquote there for me during the process. I was having a lot of anxiety and difficulty sleeping. So I was sleeping at his place every night during it. And, he helped me with the appointments set up, and he went to the appointments with me and did all that. But there were just like ways that it was handled. Like once we made the decision, he kind of acted like it didn't really matter anymore. And I was still having all this anxiety about, like what this was going to be like, what the actual process was going to be like. Like I was scared. Like I didn't know what was going to happen. Like I didn't know how the medical side of it worked. I didn't know what it was going to do for my body in the months following. I didn't know what was going to happen with us. I kept bringing that up, and I was like, are we going to be able to work through this? Like, cause this is the thing that when I talked about in the episode with Jordan, that he kind of like had stopped having sex with me. Obviously we weren't having sex while we were pregnant, but like, this is the thing, is he was like, I don't know if I can, like, if I'm going to want to have sex with you again. I don't know if I want to have sex with you, like anyone ever again. Like, kind of just going through his own feelings of fear. But it was a lot of like, once we made the choice, it's like he felt comforted. Like he was in this panic until I like had told him like, yeah, I'm on board with it. And then it was kind of like he could move on from it. And maybe that's like a universal male experience because you're not the one going through it, but that wasn't what was happening for me. And so, he tried to be understanding of it, from what I could see, and was there. And like I said, I went through all the appointments, but just the way that some of those things were handled. Like I remember the day I had to do it, he took care of me. He got me like heating pads and got me like chocolate and did all this stuff. But he also, like, when he Venmo'd me for part of the medical bill, his Venmo transaction to me said flush puppies. Like, that's not okay. He asked me if once it passed, if he could get it out of the toilet and put it into a jar to keep. Like, that kind of shit is like not okay. And these are the kind of things that like stewed up for me, and then made worse by the fact that like a week after this was my birthday. And when we decided to go to the concert, I spoke about this on the episode with Jordan. And this is the part where I said there was like gaps in it. And I had mentioned that we got in that huge fight. And it's because we were having a really good night together for my birthday. We were at a Glass Animals concert. And, I remember having this big, like, dancing frenzy with him at the end of Heat Waves, like having a great time. And, he's like kissing me at the concert and all this stuff. When we get back and I try to initiate sex, because like we've been drinking a little bit and like things are like good, we're finally past this thing. I think it's been like only a few days, but I'm just like, I'm trying to like get any kind of like love and validation as I can at this point. And he rejected me and was like, I don't think I can do it, and like all this stuff. And I just kind of panicked at that point, because I was like, I don't know, like, how do we come back from this? Like, I kind of thought we got past it, not over it, but like past it together. You still came on this trip with me, and I already had this internal fear. Like, this man, to the extent of didn't want kids, like he used to tell me that celebrity crushes that he had, like on women, once they got pregnant or had kids, he didn't have crushes on them anymore. Like he literally didn't find them attractive anymore. And so I'm like, how am I not supposed to think that this is going to be an issue for us forever? Like, and so it turned into this fight. And when I told in the story with Jordan that some of the things that really stayed with me is that in that fight, what happened essentially is that we kind of, for the first time, hashed out everything about the breakup, hashed out everything about the pregnancy that we were feeling, and no one really had talked about it before. And he told me that he ultimately is glad that everything happened the way it was, because he could not fathom the idea of having a child with me specifically, that I would be a terrible mother, that he just basically threw everything that I'd confided in him for 4 years, about my fears about parenthood in my face. Like, was telling me that like I would have been an absolute nightmare to co-parent with, that I would have fucked up a kid beyond belief, and like all of these things. And that, this was just, it was just, it was just the epitome of how cold and mean he was capable of being when he was drunk and angry. And this is the same fight that I said in the podcast with Jordan, is that the next morning, then after we'd gone through all that, like he was going through saying all these things to me. And then that very night, he's the one that stopped and was like, look in the mirror. We're too fucked up to be fighting. We should go to bed, after unloading all this. And I was like, okay. And then wakes up the next morning and apologizes to me and tells me he is in love with me and he's just confused. And, I told this in the podcast that, the last podcast, that then he was like, that's crazy how horny I am right now. And then proceeded to have sex with me all day. Like after that was the entire thing. Like it was just a constant mind fuck. And so like we're a week into that and we're going through all of this. And then it's only another barely 2 weeks before all the stuff that I recounted in the first few episodes, where then there was this blowout. I found out that he had been sleeping with someone else. Text messages I read, I found out that the weekend of the abortion, that the girl that I found out he slept with, he was like trying to see her like within like a day of that happening, like while he was still seeing, like it was just a lot. And then, when I kind of, he blew up on me about talking to someone like in a text format that I didn't even know yet, and how all that happened. It was just so overwhelming to me to be like, how is this even happening? Like we just went through all this shit together. And I also let him know in advance that doctors had let me know that my hormones and everything were going to be like a little bit off the chart for a little bit still, and that I would have a lot of high emotions. And I was just not in a good space to be like regulating myself. And he, we got in that huge fight and everything, and then he just left. He did that. Everything that I shared is still what happened when it comes to like just basically getting that huge fight, saying all that terrible things about the manipulation and all that stuff, and then sending the text to me that, blocking me and ending things over a message. That all happened 2 weeks after we went through all this together. And that is just the part of this that left the most trauma to me, because it was just like we went through this thing that like I was having to carry, and it was such a difficult thing for me to decide, and like to have all these like feelings of like I only have this experience with him, and for him to just like leave after something like that we both went through, it really fucked with a lot of my abandonment issues that I already have. And it's still a miracle to me how all this even unfolded. How I even got in this position is because, like I said, I didn't have a period from competing, but it was like about to come back. And we basically conceived like 4th of July weekend. So it was like about to come back right away. And the reason it didn't come back was the pregnancy. I actually was told by a doctor I saw that there was a very high chance that I would miscarry, even if I didn't terminate myself, because guys, I was like, I don't even know, like 10% body fat, maybe like at the time that this happened. Like, my body wasn't really in a place to sustain. I'd been in like a deep deficit. I'd been on, PEDs for bodybuilding. Like I had a lot of stuff going on that like, it really was baffling that I was able to even have this happen. And the chances of it going successfully were low. And again, that wasn't, my ultimate reasoning. But it is the choice that we made, and the way things ended up with Goodwill, I still feel very affirmed in that choice. So that is my story, and something that I feel like now with the Roe versus Wade overturn has made me even more infuriated, and like just feel like this is something that still needs to be talked about. But it's also one of those catalysts for all of this shit with me mentally. So like we went through that. I felt like I was left right after that. And then, within a couple weeks, is when I found out about Jordan. I didn't know it was her at the time. So he had like moved on right away. And that's something Jordan really wanted to speak to in the podcast too. And she was just respecting that I hadn't shared this yet, is that she's like, I was mortified when I found out the real story about like, she's like, you guys had just went through that. And then he like moved on to me like that. And, it's just a lot. And I found out things that when he finally told her about that scenario, what he actually said happened, it was really fucking triggering as well. I'm going to save that because Jordan is going to come back on with me. But, she shared things with me about that. And basically all of this was just happening. And, I already shared in the other one like that. Well, a few weeks after that, or actually the day I found out about Jordan, I was roofied while I was on vacation. And then, I came back to a broken car, and like, I didn't have a car for like a month. And it was just like all these things kind of combining. And as I'm slowly uncovering after I went to the retreat about, the narcissistic thing and all of that stuff, it was just a compilation. And so that whole perfect storm melding is what got me into this place where the depression and anxiety issues and the c-PTSD was coming up. And so what that's looked like is that for the last year, unfortunately, it's one of the most popular songs of the last few years, but I guess it's just an accumulation of, I've talked about it in therapy a lot. And so there's a lot of different reasons. We can't really always have a specific thing because nothing traumatic happened to me during that specific playing, but I associate that night as like one of the last good nights and one of the most horrific nights where like all of my worst nightmares were coming true in terms of like the fight we had at that hotel after the concert. So I'm still really struggling with, I have a severe heat waves trigger with that song by Glass Animals. It's to the extent where it's I want to be very clear when we're talking about like c-PTSD or PTSD triggers, that when that kind of thing happens, it's not like, we've all had things, and I still do too, where you like hear a song and they remind you of an ex and you're like, oh, I don't want to listen to that. Or like you shut it off because it makes you upset, or like you're like, fuck that song. Like, we all have that reaction. This is this has never happened to me in my entire life. And it's every time I've had friends witness it happen, and it's like really unsettling. It's an instant. I've had a variety of things happen. I've been out here on Rainy Street when I had not been drinking yet. I had had one drink of the day, and it came on somewhere, and I had to go into an alleyway and throw up. I've broken into sweats places. I have fainted once when I was in Chicago. I literally will start having like tremors, hand tremors. I start like breathing and hyperventilating a lot if I hear that song play. So, it's not a fun time when it's a massive top 40 hit because you cannot avoid it. It also became a large TikTok trend, so that was super fun for me for a while. We were trying a couple different things, and then I moved away. So we are going to maybe try some exposure therapy because even a year into this, it's still really bad for me. That's my most like noticeable one. There are a few other things, but ultimately this is something that triggers me in just dating patterns in general. I have a really hard time as I'm starting to try to connect with people. I have just that general distrust of things. And I find myself flocking to people who like recreate the pattern, and then I get triggered by the pattern. It's just been a really fun fucking time. But ultimately, it is a lot and it is something I'm still trying to work through. And I just felt like I really wanted to come on and be upfront and share some of that, because going through a lot of this stuff without feeling like anybody else understands you or feeling like you're insane is really hard. And I just kind of wanted to get it off my chest a little bit. And also let you guys know that like it does cause you to behave in ways that aren't ideal. And, as a result of like the episode last week, unfortunately, as I said at the end of the episode, I was like, I don't think the people involved in this know. And if they do, sorry, they know now. So I did kind of raffle some feathers. Was that the thing? And that was not my intention. But I also felt like, again, I'm never coming on here to be a defense mechanism. I feel like I made it very clear in last week's episode that like, I'm not proud, owned my shit. It happened. I do still plan on telling my other stories about what kind of came after that. But I did want to kind of speak to like where I was at in terms of like my mental state when I was getting into said entanglements, because the reality is until this stuff is kind of a little bit more under control for me, dating is a little bit dangerous. But also some of the only way out of it, as I learned in therapy today, is to keep dating and face it. So unfortunately, that just puts a lot of other people in the wreckage, and I'm working on just being a lot more upfront about what it is I'm dealing with. And if some lovely man is willing to be on that roller coaster ride, bless his soul. And if not, I don't really blame them. So as far as anyone that's wondering about my current dating life, how that's been going, TBD, because that is where I'm at, is trying to kind of come to terms with that. Because like I said, some of this depression and anxiety feelings and some of these triggers, like the horrific nightmares, all of that stuff has been coming back over the last 3 weeks or so. And I'm back to feeling exhausted. I'm back to struggling with focusing. And it's really hard, especially when you're trying to like run a business and work and, have a life. So I feel like this was a little bit all over the place. I also am aware that it's a little bit polarizing, and that there may be some listeners who listen to this and are not going to understand where I'm coming from, or not going to feel like maybe I have like enough remorse for the decisions I made or any of that. And, you know, you're allowed to have that opinion. It's okay if you don't want to listen anymore. It's okay if I'm not your cup of tea or you don't agree with me. But at the end of the day, you don't have to agree with me, because you don't have to sit here in my shoes in my life. And you weren't the one that has to carry on with the decision that I made. That I am, in hindsight, 100% glad that I made, because let me tell you, I think often about where I would be right now when it comes to Goodwill if that had gone differently, and the even potential of the many different avenues that could have taken almost makes me like, I feel physically ill when I think about it. Like, I just had trouble even articulating it now, because I could feel like my stomach feeling hot. Like, when I think about how that would have just tied me to that scenario, whether he chose to be present or not, it would have been with me forever. And I am just I'm just very glad that I didn't do that. So I hope that this gives you a little more insight and understanding. And also just a constant reminder is always my goal, that like people have more going on than it seems. I think coming on here all the time and like, you know, I've tried to make it really clear that I'm trying to keep the responsible side as much as the unhinged side, but I come on and like try to make light of and make jokes. And, you know, I always talk about, you know, dark humor and like trauma makes you funny, but like the underlying thing is that there is trauma under there and there is shit that like puts it, and I can show up and like laugh about the situations, but even that in itself is a form of coping for me. And sometimes I think I just got to be down to earth and real with you guys. So if you resonated with this, or you have a story that you've been afraid to share for yourself, whatever that may be, I want you to know that my ears are always open. You can message me on my personal accounts. You can message me on Responsibly Unhinged, and I will hold space for you for that. And I also just want you to know I see you if you don't even want to come forward. And I just hope that this makes you feel more seen, and like that your experience is not just yours. And that I know how difficult the world sometimes makes it to just make your own choices. So I love you guys. If you're still here with me, if this episode, you know, if you do feel like it was helpful or you enjoyed it, I would love for those ratings, reviews, etc. I'm sure I will maybe get some of the opposite from this type of subject, but I'm okay with that. So thank you so much. I will be back with all the bullshit in the near future. Hopefully I will be back with Jordan really soon now. We've got more to tell, and I feel like we have a more open platform to talk about it now. Because that is a really heavy, this whole thing was a really heavy part between the two of us of like being eye-opening for each of us. So bless her, excited for her to come back, and bless all of you guys for riding with me on this. Thanks.